Okay, this 6 o'clock. It's time to begin. My name is Brooks Spector, and I'm associate editor at the Daily Maverick, among other things. And we have assembled a panel of serious experts, people who actually know America well, but at the same time know a great deal about Africa, and so have the ability to do the comparative understanding of what has turned out to be an enormously consequential election in the United States. All the results aren't in yet, as most people know, but the earthquake has happened. Donald Trump won the presidency, and the Republican Party is well on its way to owning the Senate and probably the House of Representatives as well. Let me introduce our guests. Chris Wan, who teaches at the State University of New York in upstate New York. I believe he did field work in Lesotho a few years ago, and pays attention to African politics as well as his home country. Olila Montlu is an old friend, studied at MIT years ago, has taught in many universities in South Africa, has now teaches at the George Washington University in Washington, but he's had visiting fellowships and research fellowships at various prestigious institutions in the United States, and has studied American politics with a degree of interest and enthusiasm as an outsider who's able to look inside. And David Smith may not be unfamiliar to many in the audience either. David was the Guardian correspondent in Johannesburg for many years, and he visited almost every country in Africa which had airline flights going in and out of it. And he now is the Washington correspondent for The Guardian. All three men, really good insights and ideas and understandings of the current circumstances in America. I don't want to do the usual South African thing of reading long CVs. I think that's everybody understands we have really good panelists. And I think there are four questions that I'll just lay out for you. And we'll give each of the panelists a few minutes to discuss them, and then we'll do a second round, and then we'll open it up to questions. I believe there are about 1,000 people or so watching this, so be mindful of the fact there are probably people all around the world paying attention to what we're doing here right now. First question, obviously, is what happened? Is this one of those realigning elections in which the basic power for a party and its supporters has changed dramatically? Why did it happen the way it did? What did Kamala Harris do wrong? And what, after all, then did Donald Trump do right? What does this mean for the United States? And then fourth, how is this going to affect Africa, South Africa, and the rest of the globe? And let's see, who should go first? David, I think you have been doing the most traveling and following of the most campaign efforts and speeches and rallies and everything else. Why don't you take a first crack at it?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Great to see everyone. I am speaking from West Palm Beach in Florida, having attended Donald Trump's election watch party last night in a convention center, where, as you can imagine, there were thousands of Trump fans dressed in Make America Great Again regalia, and what was initially chatter and drinking turned into a celebration as confidence surged. Results were announced on these giant TV screens. When Pennsylvania was called for Trump, the room utterly erupted. And again, when his victory was confirmed, and finally, at about after 2 o'clock in the morning, we saw Trump, his wife Melania, his children, and others take the stage, and Trump deliver a speech where he claimed he will now push for unity after 4 years of division. But based on everything we know about Trump, I wonder about that. He also specifically praised South African-born Elon Musk, now the world's richest man, for helping his campaign. Someone said that's an ominous sign of what role Musk might play in a second Trump administration, and he also praised Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is a vaccine conspiracy theorist who might now be involved in healthcare. So that could all be a sign of things to come. I mean, the people in that room were always confident Trump was going to win. Opinion polls suggested it was going to be a very tight race, and that probably at the time we're speaking now, maybe we wouldn't still know the results. But clearly, for the third consecutive time, they underestimated Trump's support. And why did he win? I mean, many voters said for them the biggest issues were immigration and the economy. And despite Trump's wayward messaging, his gaffes, his insults, all the distractions, I think many people still regarded him as strongest on those issues. Ever since he came down an escalator at Trump Tower in June 2015, he's really made immigration his signature issue. Plans to build a wall. Now he's promising the biggest mass deportation operation in American history. People actually like that, despite the liberal criticism. And polls showed actually a majority of Americans favor these deportations. Even a significant chunk agreed with Trump's Hitler-style rhetoric, talking about immigrants poisoning the blood of the nation. This is a wake-up call, an alarming reckoning for what American society is and what it wants. I'll just finally say also on the economy, by most metrics, Joe Biden did a great job. And just the other day, The Economist magazine published an article saying America's economy is the envy of the world. It had the strongest recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And yet Biden's approval rating was stubbornly low on that issue. He got very little reward. And that created a problem for Kamala Harris. She couldn't entirely disown Biden, but she couldn't quite distance herself from him either. There was a TV show where she was asked, what would you have done differently from Biden during his presidency? She said, well, I can't think of anything. That clip was played a lot. And really it was asking a great deal of her to put together a campaign in just over 100 days after Biden dropped out. I think there's also the issue here of she would have been the first female president in America's 248-year history. She's a woman of color. What does it say that so many Americans were not ready for that? And then yet again, white women supported Trump. All of it really is a sobering verdict. And she was held to a double standard, I think, as one TV commentator put it. Donald Trump gets to be lawless. Kamala Harris has to be flawless. And that indicated that there was always a double standard in operation, I think.
David, thanks very much. Julio, do you want to take a shot at this now?
Oh yeah. So what happened?
Couldn't hold you back, I know.
I don't live far from Howard University, where the Kamala Harris watch party was going to take place. I live in DuPont. And I started walking towards, Howard. This is about 5 blocks from where I am. And I saw people coming back, right? Instead of going towards the event. And I had, and Georgia had just gone to Trump. And I knew it was over. I just told, so I also turned back, I just went to sleep. In some ways, I was here in 2016 in the United States. So in some ways, the disappointment I experienced in 2016 kind of softened the blow this time around. What happened and why? It's a modern day reincarnation of the Southern strategy. Remember that? But now the ogre is, of course, immigration and the border. And it's basically the Republicans kind of like pivoting towards the politics of fear, fear of the immigrant in particular. But I should also say that The 2020 census pointed out that in 2020, for the first time, there was a decline in white Americans as a group, as a proportion of the population from the 70s to the lower 60s or something like that. And Trump played very much into those politics. I mean, even the language, he used Hitler-like language, poison in the blood. I mean, that's straight out of Hitler. Contamination of the American body politic. Now, you would have thought that all of that would have dissuaded, Americans from voting for this man. I mean, you ask yourself, okay, how much more vulgarity do you really need from a presidential candidate to walk away, from that candidate? And clearly no amount of vulgarity or racism or sexism could dissuade folks. I was looking also at the exit polls. Interestingly, the NBC exit polls, immigration was only about 11% as a concern among the voters. And ironically, abortion, was only 14%. And the big one was the economy. And you ask yourself, but, as David was saying, the economy is the envy of the world, right? So for me, it is this appeal to these issues of racial identity and really the misogyny that still characterizes, and that's across the board, by the way, Black, Latinos, whoever, right? Not ready for a woman to be president of the United States yet, What did Hillary Clinton call it? The toughest glass ceiling, in US politics. I mean, that the United States is still unable to reconcile itself to women leadership at this late juncture is just appalling, quite frankly. But I am also reminded of something that Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo said to each other shortly after the National Party was elected to government in 1948. They were at a meeting, an ANC meeting, an overnight ANC meeting. And as they walked out, they were shocked, right, by the results which were announced all over the posters, the newspaper headlines. And Oliver Tambo said to Mandela, "I'm happy this is happening. I'm happy that the nationalists have been elected." And Mandela said, "But how could you, right? I mean, that doesn't make sense. The racists have been elected." And Tambo said, "At least now we know what we're dealing with." And I think that is where we are in the United States, that there is a realignment on the right, but I think that there has to be a realignment on the left and the center. And the old playbook, by the way, that the Democrats have been using just doesn't work. They have to go back to the drawing board and reformulate their strategies.
I'm going to break in here and ask Chris if he'll offer his thoughts. I'm mindful of the fact that we don't have the 3 hours necessary to have this conversation. Chris, if you'd like, please.
I'd be happy to. Thank you so much. I'm really delighted that I was invited to join this very august panel to talk about these things. As a political scientist by training, as some of you know, I'm very interested in some of the factors that David and Oleta have both spoken to here. It's clear that America is a closely divided country in a lot of ways, and even when you peer into the results, you'll see that although the Republicans won comfortably in this context, the Democrats still have a significant amount of support in very many places around the US. I live in, I think as Brooks says, I live in upstate New York. So I am closer to Montreal than I am to Manhattan. And I live in a district that is represented by Elise Stefanik, who is a very vigorous Trump loyalist. So even though Harris won New York by a comfortable margin, she didn't win by an overwhelming margin. And in the district in which I live, Stefanik won quite comfortably herself. And so I think it's important to know that even in states that Trump carried, there are pockets of significant Democratic support. So just be aware that these things are going on. Typically, when I talk about elections in a variety of contexts, I talk about the structure of voting. The US, as many of you are aware, is a federal system. So states have a lot of power that is distinct from that of the central government. We have a sort of single member constituency system or first past the post system. So when representatives are elected, it doesn't matter if you get 50% of the vote. If you get one more vote than your opponent, you win the seat. So that's the kind of thing that I often see playing a factor in the way these results happen. What was interesting about this particular election is that those kinds of factors, the single member constituency voting and the electoral college, which is often thought of as a counter-majoritarian kind of a structure, didn't play in this time as much as I expected that they would. And from another perspective, I think that many Americans and a lot of our international scholars sometimes confuse populism and conservatism. And we think of Trump as conservative, but Trump is genuinely populist. They are not the same thing, and Trump knows it. That where a lot of the conventional old guard Republicans are very much for limited government, for free trade, lower taxes, judicious government spending, let's say, Trump could not care less about most of that kind of stuff. And, he hasn't paid attention to the budget deficit in the least, not when he was in office, not during the campaign. What he cares about is getting to those visceral gut level issues that he thinks his voters like. And what was clear is they did, and Trump carried every state that was within the statistical margin of error. So I think those are some interesting things to look at. In terms of the how it happened part, I think that it's a combination of some failure on the part of analysts to understand quite what's going on, partly because polls are less effective than they used to be. People have cell phones, they don't have landlines, they don't respond to surveys in quite the same way that they did in the old days. And I think it's a little trickier to get an accurate read on what's going on. But as I say, still, the statistical margin of error called this close. It was close in terms of the popular votes. So I think that's worth keeping in mind. I think that analysts really have not quite come to grips with the impact of social media and the prospect of disinformation that's floating around in the American political ecosystem. There's a lot of stuff going on here that, false information, inaccurate information, misrepresentative information. I follow a lot of people on Facebook and, Twitter, X, and other places on the right and the left, trying not to live in an echo chamber, as it were, and just to try to understand where people are coming from. And I was kind of stunned how much bad information is floating around and people's unwillingness or inability to discriminate between accurate information and inaccurate information. And that really does make an impact here. The other things I think and I think the other speakers have talked to this, is there's a lot of mistaken assumptions about how this election was going to play out based on things Trump did. People thought, a lot of analysts thought the seeming chaos that was associated with Trump's first term was going to negatively affect him. It did not. They thought his legal woes were going to hurt him. They did not. His intemperate remarks about race and about women would hurt him. They did not. His anti-democratic comments about being a dictator for a day, people thought that would hurt him. It did not. People thought, a lot of analysts have sort of treated Latino voters and African American voters as largely monolithic voting blocks, and Trump's message resonated with a lot of people in those communities, and that really cut into Harris's support, and even the kind of assumptions that some people were making about where those votes were going to break. So I think that those things are real big issues. A lot of Democrats and progressives thought that Trump was just so awful he couldn't possibly win. Well, a lot of people clearly didn't see it that way. And our other speakers were talking about the Biden domestic and economic policies. As healthy as the economy is by any objective measure right now in the US, people don't feel that way. And a lot of these bread and butter issues are really about emotion as much as they are about other things. And another comment I think that Olela made is really important with talking about the Southern strategy point. I think a related theme is that these so-called Rust Belt states, the industrial powerhouses of the 1950s that are now economically distraught, are way more right-wing than most Democrats are comfortable acknowledging. And a lot of this is in fact old news, but that lesson really hasn't gotten through to Democratic politicians. I think back, speaking of Southern strategy issues, in 1972, when the Democratic primary was going on, the candidate who won the Democratic nomination was George McGovern, who was widely considered to be on the left. He got eaten up very badly in the general election by Richard Nixon for a lot of complicated reasons. But what's interesting is even in the primaries, when McGovern was running in the state of Wisconsin, which we see as a swing state, the number 2 candidate in the Democratic primaries in 1972 behind McGovern was George Wallace, who was, the governor of Alabama and exactly the kind of emblem of or avatar of that sort of Southern strategy. A lot of Wallace voters, they were registered Democrats, but they were not going to vote for somebody like McGovern, and they ended up voting for Nixon. And that has really been part of the Republican strategy for a long, long time. So those are just a few of the comments that I would make about this, but I have obviously 17 more hours of things to say, but I will shut up now.
I'm going to change my plan a little bit because I'm getting a lot of questions, and I'm going to collapse them all into groups, and then just give everybody a chance to just take them in sequence. Starting with the first collection, does this mean that the United States has a mobster as a president, and what is the role going to be for people of the ilk of Elon Musk and RFK Jr. in the new administration? That's question 1 to 3. How much importance was the race card as it was played by Donald Trump? What does the Trump administration that is coming in going to mean for Africa? And by this, the questioner is asking specifically, what is the future of AGOA? And I'll add some of the aid programs like PEPFAR, the HIV and AIDS program, and Power Africa. The next question, is America simply unready for a woman president, let alone a Black woman president? The next question is, what was the role, what was the impact, the influence of churches? And I think broadly speaking, churches of all types, from the fundamentalist charismatics on through to traditional Black Baptist churches, as well as others. And the last question I have so far, well, it's not the last anymore, is the Electoral College as it is organized now an anachronism of the past and should be done away with? And the last question that I have in front of me at this moment is, what exactly do we think Donald Trump is going to do with regard to the Middle East, to China stroke Taiwan, or to Ukraine stroke Russia? That's about a 2-hour agenda for each of you, but David, you've been patient now. Why don't you start?
I'll take the first couple. Yeah, does America now have a mobster? Well, it certainly has a convicted criminal coming in as president for the first time in its history. Remember, Donald Trump convicted on 34 felony counts just this summer. Feels like a lifetime ago in that trial over his hush money payment to an adult film performer, Stormy Daniels. Again, I still I'm amazed I'm using these words about an American president, but this is where we are. And during his entire business career, there were lots of shady deals and paying people off and bankruptcies and fraud allegations, being sued by the Justice Department for racial discrimination in properties he and his father owned, and allegedly some contacts with the actual mob. And then, of course, more recently, the case I mentioned with the conviction, that's just one of 4 investigations into Trump, a couple of them over the January 6th insurrection, another one over his retention of classified documents. It was really a dramatic, I mean, Brooks and I love theater. You couldn't have scripted a bigger drama than the crossroads for Donald Trump last night. Defeat could have meant prison and total ruin, whereas victory led a very different path to becoming the most powerful man in the world. I mean, those were the stakes for Trump last night. And yet again, this man who has a charmed existence, who always seems to ride his luck, he got lucky again. And the general assumption is, from the office of the presidency, he will be able to make these criminal cases go away. He will fire Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, and turn the Justice Department into an entity loyal to him. And yeah, America's never been here before. And to top it all, a recent Supreme Court ruling means the president has more power, more immunity than ever. It's a very sobering thought. In terms of the second question, so there's been a notion that Elon Musk might get involved on some kind of commission for government efficiency. He's talked about potentially slashing trillions of dollars of worth of federal government bureaucracy, just making it more capitalist, more ruthless, more efficient. That could see thousands of federal government workers lose their jobs. If new ones are hired, there will probably be Trump loyalists and lackeys. So that is alarming. Every election supposedly has an October surprise. Perhaps the emergence of Musk was the October surprise in this one. And I didn't know whether we were going to get the Musk with the golden touch with Tesla and SpaceX, or were we going to get the Musk who's a clown, as we've seen with X, just lost value and users. And in the end, clearly it was the more gifted Musk who brought his money, more than $100 million, and power to bear in Pennsylvania, especially. Remember, he was even giving away checks for $1 million to people, encouraging them to vote. And now the world's richest man is allied with Donald Trump. As for Robert Kennedy Jr., who I interviewed last year, he has some very extreme views on health in particular, on race and other things. He is said to be working on healthcare, including women's health, which has already raised alarms. I don't think he would actually be made health secretary, but just in the last 2 or 3 days, Trump has been saying things like, Bobby Kennedy, he's great, he can do whatever he wants, as if he's going to have free reign. And that in itself is a very disturbing prospect. But notably, Trump keeps saying the one thing he won't allow Kennedy to touch is liquid gold, as in oil. Kennedy is something of an environmentalist, but Trump's approach is drill, baby drill, and he wants to boost American energy production even further. And by the way, under Joe Biden, it's already hit record levels. It's not as if he's a great climate figure in that sense, although there were other strong merits. But so, on top of everything else, I think we should remember today is a potentially very dark day for the planet, given Trump's previous denial that climate change is even happening. Last time he pulled the US out of the Paris Accords, and that, I think, partly answers one of the other questions in terms of Trump's effect on the world, including Africa. This is going to be very regressive in terms of the struggle against the climate crisis.
Perhaps you want to take a swipe at some of these. I'm looking at my list that wasn't yet addressed. The effect of churches, the Democratic agenda drove voters toward the Republicans, and the race card. What was it? What was its effect, if any? Those are now there are more coming in, but
I think the issue of race and gender it's very clear. But the point I wanted to make is a broader one. That we are in a moment in time. We should never forget that we are in a moment in time. Now, the implications, of course, are going to be over the next, decade or so. But I'm as you know, I've just finished writing a biography of Nelson Mandela. That's why I keep going back to Mandela. Hopefully, it'll come out next year. It will come out next year. Mandela taught us also the long view. It's important to look at this in terms of a longer view. It does seem to me that the United States is entering I don't want to be overly dramatic and call it a crisis, but there are certain things that are going to happen in fairly short order, which Trump had predicted, and they're going to have an implication in terms of, for example, the legal system, particularly the U.S. Supreme Court, is already suffering a credibility problem, and that's just going to get worse. In terms of foreign policy, that also will certainly get worse, especially given that the Republicans have also taken over the Senate and most likely the House. And here, South Africans have got to be very strategic. We've done a very bad job as a country in terms of our foreign policy. We've basically almost went out of our way to antagonize the United States, and which I think is just very much unstrategic. But then, of course, right, Trump's victory is going to further reinforce, actually, the people who believe that the United States, anyway, is not a model any longer. So it's going to drive a number of people further away from that strategic alliance with the U.S. Does the U.S. have a mobster? Of course, there's a mobster now for a president.
That's straightforward.
But and I mean, the first order of business, as I said earlier, is that Trump is going to get rid of all these cases against him. So to call him a mobster is of course a metaphorical way of describing him. I mean, he has been described as a fascist as well. So there's no doubt about what the political culture is going to be. There's no doubt about what the legal culture is going to be. There's no doubt about what the foreign policy implications are going to be. I mean, Russia, rejoiced. I think the foreign minister said, hallelujah, right? So everything is going to move basically in the wrong direction. I can't see any positive coming out of this. However, as Chris said earlier on, one of the things that the United States has going for it is the federal system, that the states still have that autonomy. I live in DC, right? I live in DC, and living in DC, right? I live in a bubble, right? I would have thought the world, I mean, I went to a Kamala Harris rally and I thought, yeah, we've got this, right? I live in Massachusetts, right? I have nothing to worry about. There's something good about that, quite frankly, that I'm not as kind of like scared as if I was living in those red states. So there is still that level of space, if you like, for people to start organizing, but also to go into those red states and organize. I know I haven't addressed all of the questions. I couldn't possibly do, but the most important thing for South Africa and for Africa in general is how do we renegotiate this relationship with the United States and not throw out the toys simply because Donald Trump has been elected. We have to build that relationship.
You made a very interesting point that people have to organize, people have to go into the red states, something that it's gotten lost in the shuffle of the discussion, not just here, but generally in the last day and a half of cataclysmic events, that there's always another election. And that in just 2 years' time, the entire House of Representatives is again up for election, and another third of the Senate is up for election. And if my numbers are correct, the next election, there are more Republican than Democratic senators who will be up for either election or seats that have been Republican. So there is, in that sense, what you're saying about going out and organizing, that there's a particular concrete political process that can be talked to as well.
And, there's a new generation of young people who are going to be entering, right, the electoral system. And as a university professor, I see a whole lot of them. I've young kids, and I have hope that those young people will have an impact. What do we have? We can only live in hope.
Yeah, the other thing that you didn't mention, except in a general way, several questioners have spoken to, you talked about the U.S. South African strategic relationship, which needs a rethink on this side. But the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which allows duty-free export from South Africa and other African nations into the U.S., comes up for renewal or expiry next year. And there has been much talk about whether or not South Africa should even still be allowed to have that entry for strategic reasons, some of which you have alluded to. Chris, why don't you take a whack at some of the questions that weren't answered? Do I have to review them for you, or are you?
No. Well, I think I can hit some of them. First of all, I would like to disagree with the argument that Donald Trump is a mobster, because mobsters are way better organized than the Trump campaign. So I think that's a little misleading.
A note of levity. Thank you.
Well, but I mean, obviously, I think it's important to start with a couple of points that I think will help shape some of my remarks here. One is Donald Trump historically has been a very, very transactional leader. If you give him something, you get something back. And if he doesn't have any, or if you don't have anything that he wants, he barely thinks about you. And so I think it's really important as we're thinking about sort of Africa policy more broadly, AGOA very specifically, he has to feel like there's something in it for him. If he doesn't feel like there's something in it for him, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if AGOA floated off into the ocean. Because I don't think he's going to spend an ounce of time, an ounce of energy, or a moment of time thinking about that kind of stuff. Now, what he might care about is the natural resources, gold, chrome, platinum, strategic metals. if it's not stuff he can mine or drill for in the United States or get from other people who are friendlier to him, he won't pay any attention. But those kinds of things are going to start making a difference. I wouldn't count on things like apple exports. You know, I see South African apples in the grocery store, and I'm like, I wouldn't hold my breath expecting they're going to be tariff free for much longer. But I would think that some of the strategic minerals are something that he may have to actually pay attention to. And that's an area where I think you can have a little bit more strategic conversation based on the transactional behavior. I was thinking a lot about the military security issues in North Africa and in West Africa. And I'm like, Trump's an isolationist. He really doesn't care. And, you know, there can be, you know, Wagner Group mercenaries floating all over West Africa, and he's not going to pay any attention to it unless, of course, there's something important that he wants from those regions. If he does something positive there, he'll do it basically by accident. I just don't think he thinks very much at all about those issues. I think just a couple more foreign policy points. The two people who I think had the worst day yesterday and having a bad day today are Zelensky and Xi, because I think there's no hope that there's going to be any kind of significant funding for Ukraine coming after this. And I would expect Trump's passion for 1896 era tariffs means that the Chinese are going to start seeing anything from 50 to 200% tariffs on.
Yeah, this curious bit where he has extolled the virtues of William McKinley and his tariff-based economic policy. That sort of came out of not even left field or right field, sort of like the bleachers somewhere.
I mean, it's a very 19th century vision of how to run an economy. And, I mean, in 1896, the US economy was growing pretty fast by 1890s standards. But I think he really doesn't understand the relationship between the tariffs and factor taxes. And, if he wants to raise tariffs, first of all, that's the death of the liberal international economic order, because, the WTO and beyond, I just don't think they're going to do well in this context with a president who just doesn't believe in any of those values about free trade or open trading systems. So it's going to be awful interesting to see what happens. I do want to I briefly want to mention, because it's sort of germane to some of the issues there about where how he's going to organize his White House. And Brooks, I think you spoke to this. Trump has tried to backpedal on this Project 2025 document that the Heritage Foundation put out, but it's worth at least scanning it for things that you care about, because I mean, the thing is several hundred pages, but it's worth taking a look at some of those some elements of that, especially on things like foreign policy and economic policy, because those are areas where I think that a lot of the listeners here are going to care a lot about that.
There is an
I don't know where
front, right?
Yeah, the executive summary, right? But it's worth. I mean, there's a lot of very extended conversation about a lot of these things. But Trump is vociferously anti-Chinese, and I would really worry if I were Xi about the economic implications of that. Cuban, who one of the billionaires supporting Harris, talked about Trump is the guy who killed Christmas. And one of the things that you'll see, like, you can't get an artificial tree that's made anywhere but China. You can't get Christmas lights that are made anywhere but China. A lot of things, and the sort of gifts that a lot of kids get at Christmas time, those things are made in China. And if there are tariffs on all that stuff, it's going to be really interesting watching how people on a gut level will respond to that stuff. They won't see it obviously this year, but they may see it next year, and it will be really interesting to see how that acts.
One of the things nobody has mentioned or responded to so far was the question that was raised earlier. What was the role of churches, whether it is on the the evangelical version or the more conservative versions or the mainline versions, for that matter?
I think people really don't understand how I mean, churches aren't monoliths either, and voters aren't monolithic, I think, in their interests. So I think churches will continue to play an impact, and individual preachers will play an impact, but I don't know that it's the kind of organized get out the vote thing that people thought before. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut anyone else off, but I think that's just a quick comment.
I think maybe on the Democratic side, there was some organization, around souls to the polls, and all of that. In some communities, the churches play a big role. But then, of course, on the Republican side, I think again you'll find strong Christian evangelical support for Donald Trump. It was one of those things that it got a little bit less coverage this time because now we just kind of shrug and take it for granted, and then you sort of step back a moment and think how extraordinary it is that these people of faith are so committed to a vulgarian serial liar, 3 times married, accused of sexual harassment by more than 24 women, and they don't seem to care that he's broken pretty much all of the 10 commandments. I think, and that speaks to a deeper issue about how they regard him as their weapon, their blunt instrument against liberal forces and a changing America that they object to.
One of the things that I'm getting a couple of questions. You're being accused as a group, as am I apparently, for being anti-Trump somehow, as opposed to not his greatest supporters or cheerleaders. The question then is asked of you, are there any positives in the Trump agenda and the Trump plan and the Trump persona as it relates to America and foreign policy? That's one. And the second one is, why are people saying that the strategic relationship between South Africa and the United States, why is there a problem on the South African side? Is there anything South Africa could do differently to make it better or more effective? So this is an open question to all three of you, please.
I mean, can I say my newspaper that I work for and I are certainly not Trump fans. There's no secret of that. I will nevertheless acknowledge this is one of the greatest political comebacks of all time, to go from the nadir of 2 impeachments, January the 6th, criminal cases seemingly being down and out, and for Trump to claw his way back up to win the Republican primary, win the general election. I saw him holding a campaign rally on Monday in Pittsburgh. Remarkable for a 78-year-old. The energy, that was his 3rd rally of the day. He had another one later in Grand Rapids. A different story from Joe Biden, who's only slightly older. Trump has tremendous resilience and willpower, and again, critics would say there's something authoritarian and fascist-like about that triumph of the will, if you like, that self-belief to power through. Now, policy-wise, I think he has won some friends, even on the left, for at least claiming to be anti-war. There's a lot of complex variables, but one of the strands of Donald Trump's appeal over the past decade has been a backlash against the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And hence he is fiercely opposed to the neoconservatives who drove the Republican Party and America into those wars. There's no love lost between him and George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and his daughter Liz Cheney, who was actively campaigning with Kamala Harris. And I think Trump is very popular in military communities where maybe a family has lost someone in conflict. This resonates in parts of the left as well. They're sick of America's foreign adventurism. They actually quite like the notion that Trump will keep them out of wars. And this was a line he used regularly. He claimed to be the first president in a long time not to have started a new war. And he also kept promising, to keep America out of World War III. And just one other thing I'll say, which we can all debate whether it's a positive or a negative, but I think you could make an argument that Trump has actually won some of the political arguments. His ascent in 2016, there was a lot about deindustrialization and towns in communities across the country, especially the Midwest, the Rust Belt, that had been hollowed out by globalization and NAFTA. Senator Bernie Sanders on the left cottoned onto that as well. And the American political establishment was forced to take notice. And one thing Joe Biden did, which again, he didn't get much credit for, was really starting to address that issue with a lot of investment in those communities, building factories, a return to made in America as opposed to made in China or other overseas countries. I think a Trump defender would say he deserves some credit for shifting that trajectory and making those people, those left behind people, heard again. And then secondly, you could certainly make an argument Donald Trump has won the political argument on immigration and border security. If you look at the Democratic primary election in 2020, it was more liberal, more to the left on the border and allowing people in. And now Kamala Harris was forced to campaign on saying she would sign a bipartisan border security bill that was much tougher and more draconian. And she even refused to criticize Trump's border wall. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the wall was an object of derision. People said it was both immoral and impractical, and Democrats are no longer saying that. So that perhaps is another victory for Trump in the mood music.
You can add a third point, which is aligned with your first, which is that the argument over protectionism versus free trade has largely been shifted to everybody is a protectionist now.
I think Biden maintained quite a few Trump tariffs.
And the debate is no longer going to be whether or not free trade expansion is possible or effective, but how can it be squeezed and limited to the benefit of people in the country. Let me go back to you, if I could, in the remaining couple of minutes. The question was, what do you mean by an imbalance in the strategic relationship, or a lack of nurturing and caring for it on the part of South Africans? A couple of questions are asking you effectively to elaborate on that point a little bit more.
Yeah, first of all, I'm anti-Trump and proud of it. And second, I just don't see any good coming out of this, other than hopefully inspiring people, towards a realignment when they see the consequences of what's going to happen. I'm particularly worried about who is he going to surround himself with. At least in the past, you had people, who provided the guardrails, right? But he has learned from that, and he's going to surround himself with really horrifying people, the Stephen Millers of this world. He is going to, the first thing he's going to do, or one of the first things he's going to do, is to ask Clarence Thomas and the other guy, his soulmate, to step down from the Supreme
Samuel Alito.
Yeah, step down from the Supreme Court so he can appoint younger people. So there's going to be a remake of the US Supreme Court. Now, that is huge, right? I mean, if there's one thing that Trump would claim as like his most lasting legacy, it will be what he has done to the Supreme Court. In terms of South Africa and our foreign policy, I don't know what we gain by aligning ourselves with Russia and with Vladimir Putin. I mean, there is this notion, that these people were supported us in the liberation struggle. Quite frankly, that is like so, early 20th century. And by the way, a lot of that support came from Ukraine. Many of our people were in Ukraine. So, and the Russian...
Much better weather, too.
And the Russian economy is like minuscule. I mean, it's smaller than even the Italian economy. It's a small economy in the greater scheme of things. The United States is, whether you have Trump in office or not, the most powerful economy in the world. I mean, the Economist, in their publication, they showed that, it's 40% higher than Europe, combined. I mean, it's huge. And there's no point and by the way, one of the things we need to do, which we did very well during the struggle, better than we did with Russia, by the way, we had strong relations with American institutions, progressive American institutions, as South Africans. We had stronger South African civil society. I'm not talking about the ANC and exile. I'm talking about South African civil society has always had stronger relations with American civil society organizations going back to the 19th century. We have had no presence at all. And you can't influence American foreign policy without that presence and without that engagement with American institutions. So a lot of the stuff is just, basic institution building. We ought to build actual relationships with the states. There's a lot of space there. So this notion of just, genuflecting to some Cold War ideology is just not going to take us anywhere. And, that's just like, we just have to be pragmatic and strategic about it.
Chris, do you want to pitch in?
I think those were beautiful remarks, and I think are very well taken. I think that I think aligning yourself with Putin, any government that decides to align itself with Putin, is playing a losing hand over the long run. I just don't think. And I think Arnetto really hit the point there that the Russian economy is in very bad shape. I mean, they're in bad shape with the war. If they have to import North Korean troops to fight the war against Ukraine, that's psychotic. I mean, that's just like a ridiculously bad move. I did also want to say that many of my friends think I'm too sympathetic to Donald Trump, so I find it more than faintly amusing that someone accuses me of or suggests that I'm anti-Trump. Because and honestly, from the public policy perspective, these are important debates to have. I mean, I don't think the liberal economic order has done the Rust Belt states any kind of good for the last 30, 40 years. So it doesn't shock me at all that somebody's trying to come up with an alternative. There were even people on the Democratic left who were arguing that we don't need free trade, we need fair trade, which was basically a code language for more tariffs and greater protectionism. So I think that there are some things, and I think as the other speaker said, the American left has a very strong isolationist streak. America has always had a strong isolationist streak. So it doesn't surprise me that people are just saying, screw NATO and screw Ukraine and, be done with this. We don't need that because it just drains our budget. We don't have time we don't have the resources then to spend on issues and problems that we want to handle at home. So I think that those things are just a few elements to keep thinking about.
We have just a couple of minutes left, maybe two, but two questions that have come up that I think maybe we could just very quickly, a sentence apiece. Donald Trump's pushing 80 years old. Will he be able to carry through on a 4-year term, or are we looking for J.D. Vance or somebody to take more and more responsibility? And the second is, did Jill Stein's candidacy have any impact on the way this election came out? Maybe a sentence per person, please.
You're muted.
David, you're muted.
Let's remember, Donald Trump is the oldest president ever elected. So, by definition, we have to watch for his health and the possibility of J.D. Vance taking over. And yet, what I've witnessed on the campaign trail, he's still very energized and what in any other person would be regarded as senility and lack of mental acuity, that just seems to be the norm for Trump. So just a very bizarre situation. And no, in this instance, I don't think Jill Stein played a big role. It seems Trump and Republicans won by a fairly convincing margin.
Odile.
Organize, 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 and don't let a crisis go to waste.
Quick on that. Stein was useless. I mean, I don't think. I think we see if Trump got 50% of the vote, the third parties had nothing useless. So in terms of Trump getting booted out, I highly doubt his cabinet is likely to do that because J.D. Vance is just not serious. And I don't even think that most Trump supporters take him very seriously. And I can't imagine his cabinet trying to kick him out to do that. No, I can't speak for what an 82-year-old man is going to be capable of doing, in 2028. We'll have to see. I mean, I think the jury's out on his health, but I don't think I think he can, as long as he's healthy and compos mentis, he'll be in power.
We've come to the end of our hour. In fact, we're just a touch over it. I really want to express my appreciation and thanks to all of you. It's been a very busy week. David, I'm sure you've had about 2 hours sleep a night the last couple of days. Olila, I know you're busy, and Chris, I know you're busy. You have classes, people have to be taught. Let me just close this off by saying one of my great media heroes, Edward R. Murrow, used to end his broadcasts, see it now, even in the middle of the McCarthy Red Scare, he would look right into the camera and say to his audience, which numbered in the millions, good night and good luck.
We're gonna need it.
You've given me the answer. Okay. Chris, David, Olila, thanks all of you, and thanks to what appear to be over 1,000 people out there in the audience. We couldn't get to every question. I tried to group them together as best I could. I'm sure I missed a few, but this is the start of a Trump administration 2.0. We're going to have a lot to discuss for the next 4 years, I'm sure, and I'll be calling on all of you to help me understand this better. So good night and thank you, and to our audience and the technical staff that put this together, thank you for joining, thank you for arranging, thank you for organizing, and thank you for participating. Have a good evening.